Welcome to Unlapped. I'm Laurence Edmondson, this is Nate Saunders, and we're in our Hammersmith studio. Quite the backdrop we've got here, mate.
Yeah, this is pretty swanky. Usually we're on Zoom looking at each other, so it's good to see you in person, mate. It's been 2 weeks, I think, since I saw you in Vegas.
It's been a little while. We left each other in Vegas. I went to Qatar, and then you went to Abu Dhabi. I have to say, Nate is fresh off an aeroplane pretty much. Last 24 hours you've been in the United Kingdom, and you come here to talk F1?
Well, less than that. I think 12 hours, probably. Wow. Well, maybe a bit more than that. But yeah, I mean, it's always that last flight home is actually quite a nice one. You get on it, 7 hours long, and you're like, right, this is it. Season's done. Everyone's kind of got to a good point with Formula One. We had a great season, and it was quite nice. It gets used a lot, doesn't it, in the paddock? But it felt like kind of end of school. You're like, this is the final day of term, and now the winter break will be here and it'll be gone before we know it. So yeah, it was nice to get back, and a lot to talk about actually.
Yeah, I mean there was even some schoolyard bickering between George Russell and Max Verstappen to start the weekend, but we kind of covered that off already. So got to say before we start, remember if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. If you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. All right, let's get into it. And first thing we're going to talk about is probably one of the biggest talking points at the end of Abu Dhabi, which is Lewis Hamilton leaving Mercedes, going to Ferrari. And Toto Wolff had a nice message for him over the radio on the slowing down lap. He said, Lewis, if we can't win, you should win. And obviously, when we talk about Lewis and Toto and Mercedes, there's that missing 8th title. Everyone's got an opinion on what happened in 2021. Mercedes is very clear that they felt that title was taken from them. Lewis the same. So, Nate, this is such a big moment. What was it like on the ground in Abu Dhabi? It almost felt like he was leaving the sport at one stage.
Well, it did. Somebody joked to me, it's like, he's not retiring. He's just literally changing teams. He's going from one great team to another, and getting paid pretty well for it. Just on that quote, I think Sebastian Vettel's old quote of everyone's a Ferrari fan, even if they say they're not. Maybe Toto's secret Ferrari fan. But it was strange. I mean, what it felt like was the end of an era. When you actually look back, when you actually dig into the numbers of Lewis at Mercedes, it is unbelievable, especially when you remember the framing of it. So many people thought that was the wrong move. So many people thought, what is he doing? This guy's going from McLaren, who weren't in a great spot then, but McLaren, and again, it speaks to kind of the journey McLaren's been on since then. McLaren used to just be, well, these guys are going to win. These guys are going to win again before Mercedes do. And then for him to move to Mercedes, everyone thought it's a crazy decision. And he even said it, didn't he? He said it started as a crazy dream or whatever it was, and it's become I forget the exact phrasing of it. That's what it felt like. It was kind of drawing the curtain on that, and we haven't really heard a huge amount of Ferrari stuff from Lewis, which I think's been telling. He it's been so long in the making. He actually said to us, it's been a bit at times like living with a girlfriend you've broken up with. The two of you are parting ways. Often Lewis has gone into this break without a new contract with Mercedes. Famously in 21, he did that. We didn't know if we'd see him in a race car again. But this was different. He was coming in, and he said the thing that stood out to me being there, lads, was he was saying, and he was saying it earlier in the year, wasn't he? Everything I'm doing is the last time. At one point, the European season was the last time he saw the big motorhome. He said in Abu Dhabi, getting into the race car, he was like, "This is the last time I'm doing this." It was the last time he had a kind of hug with Bono on the grid beforehand. And I think a lot of that, I saw him. I was stood right next to his car when he pulled into his grid slot, and you could see some emotion on his face. You don't always see that with Lewis, and we haven't seen it so much with him since maybe Silverstone. So yeah, it felt like that, and I think that I'm so glad it ended on a positive note, because there was a point in the year, I don't know if you felt the same, where I thought, maybe is this all going to end a little bit acrimoniously? Is this all going to end up a little bit toxic? And they've kind of kept that core respect and admiration for each other, which I think when you've won that much together, it's always a shame, isn't it, when you look at dynasties that fall apart at the end and they're kind of saying, it was all me. We've not got that. At least we've not got that yet. But it seems like they're leaving in such a good place. And I believe Toto when he says that. I think that he does want, if Mercedes can't win, I think the one person he'd want to win next season will be Lewis. I can really believe that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is the case. The two of them still have a bond there. I think it was really stretched to breaking point at some points this year.
Which is understandable as well, right? Because of
course, I mean, it's a very awkward situation. If you turn around to your boss in January and say, by the way, by December, I'm going to go and work for your biggest rivals. And it's a little bit different to most people's jobs, because we're talking about the most competitive people pretty much in the world, but certainly in motorsport, are in that sport. And you say, oh yeah, I'm going, I'm leaving. Everything that we built, you think of all the things that Mercedes and Lewis have done together, not just on track, but off track as well. All those partnerships, all the money involved.
Tommy Hilfiger, all those guys,
with being associated with Lewis Hamilton, that is all stuff that Toto's had to go and turn around and say to all those people who said, look, I've got him for 2 years, 2 years more. And it looked like he was going to retire with Mercedes. And all of a sudden, oh, actually, guys, sorry, by the way, Lewis has just informed me that he's off to Ferrari. Now, of course, that's going to be difficult. And I talked to Toto about this in Las Vegas. And, he said that while it was tricky, and obviously he revealed before that he found out via Carlos Sainz's father, of course, Carlos Sainz, the man that Lewis Hamilton is replacing at Ferrari. Toto said he found out via Carlos Sainz Sr., and then had that slightly awkward conversation around the kitchen table with Lewis. But he said, actually, now I look back at it, and this was reflecting on it, several months after, Toto said there was no real easier way to do it. How else could he have done this? Previously, the two sides had said they would always tell each other if they were talking to someone else, but was that really going to happen? And was that possible? And also, once Lewis had made his mind, Toto wasn't going to be able to talk him around and get him to stay. So I think the way it played out, the length of time that they had to kind of live together like that was a bit awkward. One nice thing, actually, just referencing this fabulous graphic made for us by our producer Quentin.
Great stuff, by the way. Really good.
So there you see Lewis in all red. That's how he turned up on the Sunday in Abu Dhabi. And did you see that over the weekend? So he started off in a white, then he went to black, then he went to kind of red/white, and then he went full red. I mean, knowing Lewis and his fashion, that was intentional.
Oh, absolutely. We've spoken to people in the paddock, and everything he wears it's either a brand he wants to support, it's a designer he wants to support. So absolutely, and I think that it's actually pretty cool. I like that some guys just turn up in team kit all the time. It'll be so interesting next year, won't it? Seeing Charles Leclerc as kind of the company man, isn't he? He'll turn up in the the Ferrari polo all the time. Always looks. I mean, he looks great in it. But I think I'm interested to see what Lewis is wearing next year. Some of the designs he's going to have. Just to your point as well, what was interesting on Sunday in the evening after the race, great sign-off race as well, I thought, for Lewis. Obviously, it wasn't the podium, but nice to have that moment at the end, that kind of clean fight with George. I think as well for Mercedes, that really summed up this partnership. They had some difficult times with Lewis and Nico. I think it was nice for them to show, especially after everything that George said about Max at the start of the weekend, I felt that there was a real look, these two guys can keep it clean, and who knows how hard they're actually fighting each other. But in the pen afterwards, we sit, for people who are listening to this, we sit kind of just away from the TV pen, and we were watching Lewis's interviews, and actually we were kind of we were waiting for quite a while, because Lewis was, every interview he was giving so much to the journalists asking him questions. And at one point, I think he was talking to Craig Slater at Sky. He spoke to a few other people. After he spoke to Craig, he kind of stepped back for a second, just kind of, he leant over and put his hands on his knees for a bit, and just kind of, you could tell he needed a moment to himself. And I think that there were points during the weekend where that emotion got to him quite a lot. And you could tell, and Lewis has always been such an emotional guy, I think that a lot of that, he realised for the first time what was happening.
Well, in that Craig, because I was watching back home, so in that Craig Slater interview, he was asked about the final hammer time message.
That's right, yes.
And
yes.
He said, in my mind, it went through my head that was the final hammer time message. And you could see, in his eyes just welled up that little bit. He didn't break down, didn't start crying or anything, but you could see just the emotion was fully there. So perhaps he had to take a moment after thinking about that. And that's a great thing about Lewis. He always wears his heart on his sleeve.
And just on that as well, that was cool. He said to us in the pen, we asked him about the hammer time message, and he said, what's funny about that was that when I first started out, Bono would give me these really awkward, okay, Lewis, it's time to get a bit faster now. And he was like, just say it's hammer time, man. Just give me something clear. And it's become this iconic thing. So I wonder what he'll replace it with at Ferrari. Obviously not taking Bono with him. So I think that part of it as well with Lewis is quite interesting. What's going to happen next? That partnership. It's like Max with GP. It's almost part of their persona when they're at the team. So much to come with Lewis. And interested to see what happens with Merc without Lewis as well, because obviously he's their greatest driver ever. So,
indeed. Well, not the only change going into this winter, of course, by Lewis moving to Ferrari. Carlos Sainz has left. Now, Nate, you had a story.
3 Carloses here.
3 Carloses, varying emotions of leaving Ferrari right there. Nate, again, you were there. You wrote a story about this on the Sunday night. Where was Carlos's head up? Because leaving Ferrari, leaving a team that he's won races with, obviously he has that connection with, probably the team that every driver wants to race for at some point. You certainly don't want to have to leave the team before your time. Yeah. And it's a downgrade going to Williams. Let's not beat around it. I mean, Williams, hopefully they've got a great few seasons ahead of them, but it's a downgrade, isn't it?
Downgrade, and a downgrade he didn't want to make as well. It's different if you're leaving the team and you think there's a natural conclusion to this relationship, we want a title together, whatever. And also for Carlos, I think when you look at his career has just been this, hasn't it? It's been a slow clawing up. You know, he was at Toro Rosso, obviously that didn't work. Renault was frustrated when he was there. Really kind of broke out at McLaren, but really it wasn't until he got to Ferrari that I think people really saw him as this top tier driver. And I think he's always had that chip on his shoulder. You know, I think that the name Carlos Sainz has probably helped and hindered him at different times. I think that a lot of people think, why is this guy as good as, you know, all the hype that there's been around him? And, you know, when he was coming up alongside Max. I think there's always been something that Carlos looks at. It's like, people just do not give me the credit I deserve. And I think he races like that as well. He races with that chip on his shoulder. He actually said one of the things that he was conscious of all weekend when he qualified third and he finished second. He actually said it. I mean, he's not minced his words. He said, I might not be back up here for 2 years, he said. You know, so he's not even deluding himself into thinking, it might be 1 year. It could be into 26. It could be a long time. But he's been forced into that situation. So I think there was a lot of that going on. I think as well, I remember in Monza, I asked him about what his memories of the first time he drove a Ferrari was. And he said, I was fine until I looked over and I looked at Carlos Sainz Sr., his dad. He didn't call him Carlos Sainz Sr., he called him Dad. And he saw that his dad was crying. And he was like, I realized how much it meant. You know, his dad had seen him race for multiple teams, but it was Ferrari that kind of got him. And I think you're right. That does seem to happen. I mean, there's just this magnetism that Ferrari has. I mean, proven by the fact that Lewis is going there when he's nearly 40 years old. I mean, he will be 40, I think, won't he, in January? But yeah, I think the biggest thing, one of the Spanish journalists asked Carlos on Sunday, how are you holding all of the emotion in? You know, and he's like, how do you know I am? How do you know I have? You know, he's like, for you know, I've been crying away from the public view. I think Carlos is a bit like that as well. You know, I think some of those moments when the visor was down, I think that's when it would have hit him. He said that actually it was going to the grid, not getting out of the car, but climbing into the car that he felt it. Like, this is the last time I'm going to get into a Ferrari as a racing driver. And it's very easy to see these guys race and just think, oh, they don't think about that stuff. But they do. They have these things, you know, these things eat away at them and stuff like that. So I really hope that we get to see Carlos Sainz back in a top drive, because I think he's fantastic. You know, I think if you're Ferrari, someone's got to make way for Lewis Hamilton. It's not like he's being dropped for a driver that everyone's like, well, why are they doing that for? You know, so in a way, I suppose he can take some comfort in that, and I think that maybe that's helped him. I think he's said that, hasn't he? Easier to be giving up the seat for Lewis. But I think a difficult weekend all around. But a bit like Lewis's win at Silverstone, I really think his win in Mexico was really big, because I think it was just like, right, I've done it. Towards the end of the season, have got this win. It's like, I'm not going to be wondering, if only I'd got a win at the end of the year. I know he got one early, but I think then it was still so far away leaving. That was a nice moment. So it was a shame to see, but I think Carlos he's got such a smart way of looking at things. He was already saying during the race, he was thinking, like, remember how this car feels, because as we speak right now, he's testing the Williams car that he's going to be driving next year. So he's already kind of got his head in that place. And I think that ultimately is the best way for him to kind of get over the slight of having to leave.
Yeah, I think the other difficulty for Sainz leaving is, of course, he's part of this team that has come really close to winning a championship. And he's been a big building part of that. You know, I think you can sometimes overlook the drivers. Sometimes the drivers probably get overplayed in a team's success. But I think Carlos has been crucial. That Carlos-Charles partnership, they really complement each other. They're both, drivers with different skill sets. I think Lewis is going to bring his own stuff, and actually probably that little bit more that might push Ferrari right up there, because he takes all the knowledge of Mercedes and all those championship winning years. But Carlos has got to look at that and say, God, I was close to getting, the championship across the line. Of course, it wouldn't have been his championship. It would have been the team's, but that still would have meant something for him. So, like I say, he's been in the car already, the Williams. He did a filming day on Monday. He did his test day on Tuesday, which was part of the postseason test in Abu Dhabi. Of course, very early days, not much you can tell. It's basically just day zero, trying to get to know everyone, get to know some of the processes, understand what needs to be done, just how far away that car is from the front of the grid. So what can we expect from Williams next year? Because this year has been tough for them.
Yeah, really tough. And I think that probably has made his year a bit more uncomfortable, is the fact that there's not really been a moment when Williams' season's turned around in that sense. There was so much going on in Australia when we were still talking about where Carlos was going to drive, obviously when they just had to bench Sargent for the race. And it just there never seemed to be a point in the year where it really made a clear jump forward. I think the good thing Williams has got is that this seemed like just put this year in the dustbin, didn't it? It felt like there's so much bad stuff going on. They were still scoring points when they could. they had the Colapinto experiment, which, I think has maybe been, there's been good and there's been bad. Sainz coming in, to your point about testing out processes, that's mutually beneficial. He's going to see so much of that team. I think he's going to help drag them up to a level. As good as I think Alex Albon is, he's not a race winner. He's not had that experience of competing at the front end. Carlos has. And I think that with him and Vowles together, I'm quite excited about that. So I think it'll be a better year. What we're seeing with these new regulations, or these current regulations, is that one good upgrade can move you quite far up, whatever pecking order it is you're in, whichever bit of it. So I think it'll be a better year, but yeah, it's difficult at the moment to really feel super optimistic about Williams, because I feel like out of the whole grid, their season was the most consistently bad, because even Alpine had that double podium. So Alpine it would have been Alpine, then they had Brazil, whereas Williams, it was always just kind of down here. So I think that's the biggest problem probably facing him right now.
Yeah, James Vowles has been quite clear on that, and he said that he laid this all out perfectly clear to Carlos. He wasn't trying to trick him into the team or anything. That this year was not the target. Next year is not the target. 2026 is the target. That's when they're actually looking to make a serious step up the grid. And again, I talked to Vowles in Las Vegas, and even there he was saying how, some of the accidents they've had this year have actually put them slightly on the back step going into 2025. But they're willing to sacrifice a little bit of 2025 development. The one thing they're not willing to cut into is 2026 development. So, yeah, Carlos will go there and he'll, I think, have a pretty tough year to get through. I'm sure he's more than capable, because his mental resilience is high. But it's going to be a tough year to get through, in the hope that 2026 opens up and Williams makes that step. But every team is going into 2026 wanting to make a step. Every team believes that can be their year when they make a difference.
And every year we have a team that's like, oh, we thought we were going to make a step. We've actually come in and we're 10th.
Yeah, and the reality is, and this is something that Vowles hasn't shied away from either, is that the infrastructure at Grove, Williams factory, is a long way behind. When Vowles first arrived, he said a decade behind is not over-exaggerating it. So those things don't change overnight. So there's still a lot of catch-up to do. I think they can make a step, but, I think Carlos is absolutely right to relish those last few races at Ferrari, those podiums, that win in Mexico. It's so important, just because he's probably not going to have it going forward.
Yeah, and that will be surprising for him, won't it? Going from seeing Maranello, seeing all of that, to going to Grove at Williams. Lovely place, but yeah, to see the difference, I think will be quite stark for him.
Okay, so Sainz isn't the only driver testing out his new car for 2025 this week. There are a few others: Nico Hülkenberg, and Gabriel Bortoleto, new teammates at Sauber, Esteban Ocon at the Haas, Yuki Tsunoda in a Red Bull, and that's an interesting one. That's one I want to stop on just quickly before we move on to McLaren.
We'll get to McLaren, don't worry about it. Don't you worry about it.
I just want to stop on Red Bull as a whole, because it became very clear. You'd already reported prior to the Abu Dhabi weekend, but it became very clear over the Abu Dhabi weekend that the conversations would happen with Sergio Perez this week about him not continuing into 2025. Where's the situation at now?
So what it seems like the situation is at the moment is we are waiting basically to hear from Red Bull what has happened with that discussion, where they've got to with it. I think about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the decision was made that they won't continue with him going into next year. I think for quite a while, it seemed like they were like, well, maybe we'll get something out of him. Maybe Mexico will be the moment. Maybe Vegas will be the moment. That didn't happen. As soon as they made that call, the decision was, right, we've got to take this contract that we've got with him and also this contract we've given him for next year, which was probably an error. I believe the salary of that is around $8 million. There's slightly different numbers out there, but it seems to be in that ballpark. And effectively, I think what has happened to kind of try and streamline the process slightly, I think Red Bull were hoping that Perez would kind of get them out of jail a little bit and just retire and say, I'm done. I've had such a bad couple seasons. My heart's not in it. My head's not in it. I'm going to walk away. I totally can understand why Perez is not going to do that. He's got this money on the table at the end. Any person is going to think, oh, I can turn this around. I've just got to, it's always that. All I need is 1, 2, 3 good performances, whatever it is. He doesn't want to do that. And so what's happened and what was happening over the Abu Dhabi weekend was that Christian Horner and Julian Jacobi, who's his agent, I actually saw them talking at one point. They're basically discussing the next step of that. Now, for people listening to this and wondering, well, why don't they just pay him out? The bizarre thing for Red Bull, and the good thing for Red Bull in terms of how their operation traditionally has worked, is you're contracted to Red Bull, the company, not Red Bull Racing. So Liam Lawson's contract is a Red Bull contract. Yuki Tsunoda's contract is a Red Bull contract. They are just placed at RB or VCarb, or I don't know what the wording in the contract would be for that. What they're trying to do with Perez is effectively move him from a race seat into an ambassadorial role. So he'll do marketing appearances, he'll do show runs. He'll probably be the best paid ambassador of all time.
Like what Daniel Ricciardo was on when he first came back into the Red Bull fold, that kind of
exactly
role.
Exactly that. So he'll be there. He'll wear the kit. He'll be kind of the guy that keeps VIPs happy. He goes to a lot of events. The good thing about having a high profile ambassador is it means that Max, if you're Max, it means you don't have to do a lot of that stuff because you can kind of send Checo. So I think the question now is, does Checo want to do that? And if he does want to do that, he'll be very well paid to do it. If he doesn't want to do it, he effectively has to walk away or be bought out. And I think he'll get less than that, but he'll get something. And that ultimately is what we don't know yet. I think as you're listening to this, we're recording this on Tuesday. I think by the end of the week, we should have some news. It seems like it's going that way. Liam Lawson said to us on Sunday after the race, he really wants to know coming out of this week, going into Christmas, what the situation is. Obviously, you said Yuki's in the Red Bull. I feel like there is still a tiny chance Tsunoda could get thrown a bone here. But it does seem like it's Lawson. I just don't know. The thing with Tsunoda is so bizarre to me because it feels like he's done everything he needs to do. I don't know what more he could do. The only thing that they seem to have against him is that when he pushes the radio occasionally, he swears a lot. But it's like, but have you not heard Max?
But also, even that, he genuinely has stopped doing it.
But
Bahrain was a nightmare. He overreacted on the slowdown lap. He nearly caused a collision with Daniel on the slowdown lap, Daniel Ricciardo. That was unacceptable, and that's what Red Bull often point at now. But come on, the guy's genuinely improved. And he was saying that in Abu Dhabi. I saw some quotes from him where he was saying, look, you go back through my radios, you point out the one where I overreacted since Bahrain.
And it shows real maturity and growth to actually recognize that and to say, right, I need to do this. So I don't know, with Yuki, it does seem like there's a Marco's in favor and Horner's not so much. And that does seem to be the weird dynamic behind all of this. And I think Lawson, both of them think is impressed. I mean, Lawson hasn't been spectacular, but I think also, and I think you can't underestimate this, he's come in and he's just been solid. He's not crashed. He's not and when he's needed to be, he's been racy with Fernando. He was, he was aggressive with Perez. And I think that guys like Horner look at that and they're like, yeah, we like what we're seeing there. There's a bit of a fight in him. Again, harsh on Yuki because I think Yuki's got all of those traits. I think almost Yuki's been around so long now, to your point, there's almost examples, whether fairly or not, they can point at and say, well, look, that sums up what I'm saying. That's classic old Yuki. And it's like, you're talking about something from like 2 years ago, but it's like, well, don't know how his head's going to be. So to tie a bow on that whole thing, I think it'll be Lawson replaces Perez. Perez moves out. And then we have Isaac Hadjar, who'll be another rookie on the grid next year. Could have won the Formula 2 championship, lost out to Bortoletto in Abu Dhabi.
Still on the grid in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, absolute nightmare. I mean, had the chance to at least take the fight to him. And I mean, that wasn't enough to stop this all happening. But I mean, he's going in there needlessly, I would say, with a bit more pressure on him because you look at the big thing with Marco that Marco looks for. When I spoke to him for a driver feature in August, he doesn't look for individual performances, even though people always say Red Bull just make these snap decisions. He looks at patterns. He looks at how drivers react to moments, whether if they make one mistake, do they make the same mistake? Not at the next race, but are they still making it 4 or 5 races down the line? So I think Hadjar will be a very interesting one. And if he isn't that good, Red Bull are now in a position where they don't really have anyone else, unless they do turn back to Colapinto, which they looked at. I don't think they were that impressed when he started to crash a bit more. But maybe that's Colapinto's way back in. But yeah, that's the fascinating thing with Red Bull now. They're kind of the team that invented the modern day driver academy as we know it. And everyone they've got is in a car. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, it will be an interesting one. But we probably should get an answer fairly soon. I mean, of all these talking points we're bringing up in this podcast, that's one that's probably going to get answered the sooner. So let's turn the focus to McLaren. Won the Constructors' Championship. Their first one in 26 years since 1998. Which is
crazy, isn't it? Crazy.
First title of any kind since 2008 when Lewis Hamilton won the title. They did actually win the 2007 Constructors' title, but was stripped of it because of Spygate. But we won't get stuck into that right now.
And no, go on, lads. No,
I'll be tempted. But, we've got to save some content for the winter, right? I mean, it's a long old winter ahead of us. So what was it that made it all come together for McLaren this year? Because if you look at where they were at the start of 2023, struggling in testing, a technical department which after a few races in 2023 got turned on its head. So what is it that's kind of really come together and made them so successful this year?
Well, first of all, I have to give credit to the man in the middle there, Zach Brown, because I think, myself included, there's been a lot of people that have doubted the path he's taken McLaren on.
Would you like to elaborate on this particular?
He and I, in 22, when they dropped Ricciardo, I was like, what's this team doing? Why? It's not the driver's fault. There's obviously Ricciardo wasn't performing well, but I was like, there's so much bigger problems here, and he and I get on fine now. There was a real moment there where it was like, okay, and he quite fairly was like, well, you don't know what the vision is here. Fast forward that 2 years, not even 2 years, I mean later that year Stella came in when Seidel left. I think that if you want to draw a line back to a moment that McLaren had, is when Zach Brown handed the reins over to Andrea Stella, who I'm so impressed with. I mean, the way he's kind of galvanized that race team, and he's done it by not being that big of a personality, in the sense of, I don't mean in an insulting way. He's not this big Toto Wolff or Christian Horner. He's going to come out and give you this amazing quote in the media. He's very calm, very methodical, and he trusts in people. And I think there's a bit of a kind of a Ross Brawn quality to him in the sense that people hear him and they say, right, I completely buy into what he's selling me. And that was what Zach Brown put him in charge of the team for. And what Stella has been able to do, and Brown, when he's kind of rebuilt that technical team, I remember it was Bahrain 2022 when we left that test. I remember we were saying, well, I don't think James Key's going to be long for that team. I remember there were talk of people seeing him at the airport and just looked completely disheveled and kind of like knowing that the time was up. And then it was announced he was leaving the team. Since those moments, McLaren has just been on the up, and it was Miami this year when they had that big upgrade that just kind of, it turned what was already a very good car into pretty much the most all-rounded car that we had. And for them to have so successfully improved the car time after time after time, I think is the biggest credit you can give Brown, Stella, the whole team, because we've seen a lot of teams make upgrades go in the wrong direction. We saw it with Red Bull this year, Ferrari, that upgrade in Spain kind of put them on the wrong path for a little bit. Mercedes have kind of been up and down. McLaren, generally speaking, for about 2 years have been gradually rising up, and I think it's down to those decisions that were made. And Brown has said it. He said, we're ahead of schedule. He said a few years ago, and even then I remember thinking, it shows you how far ahead Red Bull were. He said, I want to compete against Red Bull in 25. And it seemed like it was like, who are you kidding? Yeah. And I'd admit, I used to hear those interviews, and you know how it is when you're interviewing someone, they say something, you don't show the emotion, but you think that's kind of a strange thing to say. And they've delivered. And to win that many races, not just with Lando, with Oscar as well. I think one thing that stood out to me is I think McLaren are braced for a bit of fireworks between these two next year. But that's a good problem to have. I think they'd rather have that than have the situation Red Bull have, where you've got one driver who you're effectively trying to get rid of and has lost you to the constructors. So they're in a great spot right now. And I think that McLaren, they've also learned, haven't they, on the job this year? It felt like there were some moments during the season where I think operationally they probably weren't perfect. Hungary, Monza was the big one with papaya rules. But to go back to Stella, I think what he's done, he's kind of protected the team from a lot of that. I think you're seeing some of the old Ferrari influence on him in that regard. But there's no over emotional approach to anything. Everything seems very, very calm, very, very measured. And they're just getting it done. So really excited about them next year. And the key now for them, they always seem to have this bad start to the season. If they hit the ground running, I think these are the guys to beat maybe next year.
Yeah. Two interesting things from Andrea Stella that he said this year. One was that when he first took on that team principal role, he wasn't sure whether he was the right person to do it. He actually needed convincing that he was the right person to do it. Now, you talk to anyone in that team and they say how inspirational he is. We go to the post-race press conferences and, he's so convincing in the way he talks. You can absolutely understand why people are willing to get behind him, put in extra hours, do everything that's needed to push that car forward. The other interesting thing which he said in Abu Dhabi was how he puts the success this year down to unlocking the potential of the staff. There were some big changes, like Rob Marshall coming in from Red Bull, I think was a key thing. He's in like the chief designer role now, big role in the team. Obviously brought a lot of great ideas from Red Bull with him. But this idea of unlocking the potential of everyone who was there already. And he said that he and Zach often walk around the factory, department to department, just talking to people like, right, what works, what doesn't work, and they make a list and, I'm sure they filter it to some extent. You can't keep everyone happy within a Formula One team. But then he said the other important thing is that Zach allows, and also talking about the management beyond Zach as well, and the shareholders, mainly the Bahrainis now, they allow them to then make those changes and support them in making those changes. So I think so often teams get stuck in their ways. They've been doing things for an awfully long time, possibly with success that backed them up several seasons ago. But if things have changed again, or there's a better idea, they have to be open to that change and open to those better ideas. And I think that's been so key to McLaren making that progress. So I agree. I think while Ferrari ended this season very, very strongly, there's absolutely every reason to believe that McLaren go into the next season as favourites, certainly as a team capable of challenging regularly. It would have been fascinating to see what would have happened if Lando had a car right from the very start, and Oscar, of course, of the season. Of course, they didn't. They had to wait 5 races. The 6th race was Miami, where they got the upgrade. Now, I was going to...
just a real quick one on McLaren. Sorry, mate. I didn't mean
No.
One thing that's worth saying as well, and we spoke to Zach about this in Abu Dhabi, he told us, and we knew a lot of teams hit very difficult times during COVID. He said McLaren, a few years ago, at the start of the decade, were months away from the Formula One team, at least, from not existing anymore. So the job he's done away from the circuit and also in what he's been able to achieve on the track, I think is really great. And it was surprising to hear that, because you never thought you'd hear McLaren and bust in the same sentence. Yeah. And I believe him, because I remember there was a point, wasn't there, when McLaren would bring all these sponsors to the team, and you're like, God, they're bringing so many people in. There was obviously investment, as you mentioned. So yeah, I think there's just been a lot of good stuff that's happened there. It's a real success story for McLaren, because before this year, 1 win in 12, and then this year they've come out the way they have. So massive. And in a weird way, I think if they'd lost the constructors, it would have been kind of an unfair way to criticize their season. Like, they didn't win the constructors. Like, well, it's had this big breakthrough season. Yeah. No one expected it. So yeah, but yeah, sorry, mate, carry on.
Well, I mean, it puts them in a position where Lando, at the end of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, having won that race, which was what sealed the championship. Lando needed to win there by the time Piastri had been taken out by Max Verstappen at the start. Lando said that next year is his year. Do we agree? I mean, this is the guy he has to beat, Max Verstappen, now a 4-time world champion. Can Lando? Is Lando the guy to do it if the car's there?
I'm not sure Lando is the guy, based on what we saw throughout 2024. Now, I think what we saw this year was, I mean, we talked about Max Verstappen a lot, and first of all, amazing season. I think that it's really easy to overlook how good Max was throughout the year. But we've kind of reached this point again, haven't we, where Max's racing style has been in the news so much that a few drivers have now mentioned it. George has mentioned it, and I think that McLaren privately would tell you the one person who's given you the blueprint of how to race this guy for a championship is Lewis Hamilton. And I'm not sure that Lando has really, put that flag down as much as he needed to. I think that Austin and Mexico clearly surprised him. The fact that, especially Mexico, that Max did made that move that he made. But I think that until people across the grid and maybe watching Formula One can buy that Lando can actually beat him across the season, they have to see that. Whether it's them to actually collide Lando saying, I'm not yielding to you. And I'm not sure we've seen that yet. I think that Lando, the good thing about him winning 4 races is that whole Lando no wins thing. I mean, it's crazy that we even used to call him that. He clearly is ready to win a lot of races. But I think, and you can maybe say the same about Charles Leclerc as well, there's winning a lot of races in a good car, and then there's taking the fight to Max Verstappen. Charles hasn't had that chance yet across the season. Lando's had about half a season, and I think he was kind of quite roundly beaten when it came to just head-to-head with Max, in those moments. So I'm not convinced yet, but I don't think that means Lando can't do it. I just think based on what we know currently, he can't. But maybe I'm being harsh on him, because he was one of the standout drivers of the year, won 4 races, bunch of pole positions. But I think that he himself has admitted, and he's very self-critical, isn't he, Lando? Very, very quick to say, I haven't been good enough. I think if he takes those lessons into next year and he actually acts on them, I think then yes, he can. But I think we need to see a little bit more, because to beat Max, the level has to be perfect all the time, and you have to be willing to kind of get your knuckles dirty a little bit in a wheel-to-wheel fight with him. But what do you think? Do you think Lando can, or do you think? Well, am I being harsh?
I actually agree with that last point. He claims that he has learned the lessons, and he claims that he did go into this season a little bit naive. He's probably bossed around by Max a little bit too much early on, didn't fight back enough, and so we'll find out. Yeah, hopefully quite early on next year whether he's able to stick to that, because since then, I think we have seen, slightly more resilient Lando. Again, that win in Abu Dhabi, it looked fairly easy, didn't it, from the front? But there was a huge amount of pressure. And obviously, Piastri getting taken out by Max wasn't Oscar's fault. But all of a sudden, all the pressure was on Lando. Because if Lando had lost that first place to Carlos Sainz and Oscar hadn't been able to get back into the points, then McLaren would have lost the championship right there. So, massive pressure on the team at that stage, massive pressure on Lando at that stage. And he was able to weather it. Now, that was only one race, and also a race where he was racing Ferrari drivers, not Max Verstappen, straight up. And of course, had a car that looked like the most competitive. But my gut feeling is if the two of them, Max Verstappen and Lando Norris, are in very evenly matched cars, Max Verstappen still wins.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I think he's just that good.
And I think that's fair. Max versus most drivers. I think just when he's in the groove he was for most of this year. Yeah, we're talking about a really high level.
And to be fair to Max as well, for most of this year, he didn't have the best car. He had a car where he needed to grind out results to make sure that he continued to hold on to that lead right and through to Las Vegas when he won it. And he won it with 2 races remaining. So, that is an incredibly high bar.
And we have Brazil as well, which was just, one of the greatest drives, most of us have ever seen in Formula One, certainly recently. And that, to me, that Brazil race was kind of, if you wanted to, there's that image, isn't there, of Max leading into turn 1 and Lando running wide. I know it's a bit misleading because Lando wasn't making a mistake there. He was kind of just going over into the slip road. But it kind of showed you the difference between them, that Lando had started pole in that race, should have been controlling it, and Max was just kind of disappearing off in the distance. That race, to me, showed you where the difference still is. Obviously, you could say that maybe in the wet, the Red Bull was better, but Max, when it is those moments when the pressure is on, I think he's still the guy you would want in the car in pretty much any situation. He's proven that time and time again. So it's not massively a knock on Lando. I think the bar is just so high. Yeah, everyone's kind of chasing that. So,
and it's the results that we don't shout about so much as well. Those results where just to get on the podium in a car that really deserves to be 6, or even just to be in the top 5 in a car that Max's teammate Sergio Perez was struggling to get out of Q1. I think that says a lot, and that's where Max won this championship. I think while Brazil was obviously the point at which it kind of looked like it had gone beyond return. It was the results up to that, making sure he continued to score points when the car really wasn't there, that made the difference.
Just quick one for you as well. We talked about Lewis earlier, and we talked about Lando now, and we mentioned Charles. George Russell, very punchy, as you mentioned at the top of the show about Max. Do you think we've not really ever properly seen George and Max share the same bit of racetrack together? I really want to see it. What do you think happens in that situation? I know you know George very well, and you've followed his career a lot closer than I have from a much earlier stage. How do you think, if you were to predict it now, how would that look on track? Do you think George is doing what Lewis did and saying, I'm not playing your game?
He absolutely is, because he did it in Baku. Was it last year? When
in the side pod?
It was
that's right. I forgot
race.
About that. Yeah.
And so I think George just wouldn't relent. Now, whether that would actually work out for George in the long term, I'm not so sure. I mean, if he has a much more competitive car, then he probably could afford to play those kind of games. But I think, between the two of them, if it really came down to it, I think Max would, again, probably win out of those two. Again, we're kind of basing this on what we've seen, what we know about these drivers. But I think George would absolutely put up a fight every step of the way and actually relish doing so. In George's mind, he's the best driver in Formula One. And I think that is how every driver has to be hardwired. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's not a criticism. That's what I think he thinks. And so if he gets half a chance up against Max, I think he's going to be almost going too far to prove it. And we've seen it with George a few times where just either chasing a victory or going after something, Singapore last year, perfect example, where he put it in the wall on the penultimate lap. Those kind of things happen with George. And that's where I fear he might let a championship slip. But my God, it would be entertaining seeing the two of them go off against each other. And
George always talks about how much inspiration he takes from Lewis. I do think there's a lot to be said that the two Mercedes drivers seem, one of them's the outgoing Mercedes driver, but they seem to be the most willing to just kind of call it how they see it with Max. And I think that comes from Toto. Yeah. And I think that one thing that McLaren have learned this year is they need to be more like that. Pure and simple. I think Zach Brown is a bit of that privately. I think Andreas Stella kind of started saying those things as well. I think that they've realised our whole mindset has to be different. We just have to be more aggressive. Nothing negative against Max to say aggressive, because some of the best drivers of all time have been aggressive, and his style of racing is just so entertaining. But other drivers and teams now are realising, if I've got the car to do it, that's not going to be enough against Max. I kind of have to fight fire with fire. So I'm really excited. Just based on what you said about George, I'm excited to see that as well. I think that would be actually behind Max v Lewis Part 2. I think that'd actually be the one I'd pay to see after that one, I think.
Yeah, and to go back to that point you just made there as well, that's the difference between a midfield team and a front-running team, and a team that's used to being in the midfield and a team that is at the front, is that you have to have that winning attitude. You have to just not care, that killer instinct. And you're right, it does come from the top. Christian Horner and Toto Wolff will trade blows all day long in the media.
And Max races like Horner leads that team, doesn't he?
Absolutely.
It's front foot forward. It's a terrier. He's a little terrier. He doesn't care. He's going to go at you. To your point.
I mean, and it filters down. It filters down across everything, across the mechanics, pit crew. You do see these teams kind of built within molds. But if you're going up against a team that has that kind of terrier attitude, if that's how we're going to borrow Toto Wolff's phrase, then you've got to have something to fight back with it. And so I think that's something that, you're right, McLaren and Norris definitely learnt this year. And what will be fascinating next year is whether they kind of use that, whether they do slightly change their approach, whether they are a little bit more hard-nosed on certain decisions. That's something that we're going to have to watch out for, I think, right from the start of the season. Okay, so I've got down here, and this is a bit cruel to thrust on you, but I'm going to answer the question as well. Way too early prediction, because at the moment we've got a number of drivers who could fight for the title next year. We've obviously got Max Verstappen defending the championship. We've got 2 McLaren drivers that we've talked about. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, wouldn't put it past either of them. 2 Ferrari drivers in Charles Leclerc and now Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, going for that title. And of course then Mercedes, they're not that far away from being a genuine competitor. George Russell, who we just talked about, and Kimi Antonelli. And then whoever is partnering Max Verstappen, maybe Liam Lawson.
Yeah,
okay,
maybe.
so let's say you've got 8 drivers right there. Nate, which one are you picking at this stage with no knowledge of how competitive the cars are going to be at the start of the season, completely blind, in the greatest ESPN tradition of way too early predictions? Where are you putting your money?
I mean, I respect you giving me this one first as well before I can throw it back to you. First of all, what an era of F1 we're in, that there is genuinely so many choices, because you're right, all the cars are so close. I think, even though we said McLaren are the team to beat, I think Max is still the driver to beat. The old Tifosi in me, though, is screaming at me to say a Ferrari driver, and I think the experience is going to win out. I think that Ferrari car is in a position that it can win a lot of races. Lewis, I think, is going to go there revitalised. This isn't going to do the British media bias allegations any good, but it's about an Italian team. And so it's not just that.
No, it's also half Italian.
Exactly. Stage, so come on, it's Italian media bias I'll take. But I think Lewis, I think that there's just something about him going to this team where they're at right now. Fred Vasseur has turned that team around in terms of there was always something just missing at the top. Binotto did a great job, but operationally there just wasn't something there. Fred has sorted all of that out. I think, again, because a bit like Lewis, he's come from the outside in. That's such a big part of the Ferrari story. Lewis, to me, feels like the final piece of that puzzle. Be a very interesting situation, him versus Charles next year. But I think if you were betting on either of those two guys, and part of the reason I've said Lewis as well, just to explain why, is I think he's the only person we've seen who has actually shown, here's how you race Max, and has said if we crash, we crash. And I think you have to be right with that. You have to be in your head. And Lewis has never been dirty with it. Silverstone was a great example where the two of them went for a very, very, very narrow piece of track. I think Stewart's got that right. Lewis was probably more to blame than Max. But it came from the only other option Lewis had there was, well, I'm going to back out and let Max pass me. He didn't do it. So I think that's going to be key. I think the Red Bull's kind of, is not in a great position. Maybe a bit of a spiral there. So Lewis Hamilton, 2025 champion with Ferrari. That's my call. And clip this up and abuse me with it. But if that does happen, incredible story, right? Because he's gone to Ferrari. And also, to him or Charles, the great thing about Ferrari right now, whichever one of those two guys wins the championship first, I mean, it's a compelling story either way. We're talking about a status of kind of Tifosi legend that obviously Schumacher's at the top, but put that person right underneath Schumacher, just given how long it's been, how desperate they are to win that. So I think it's going to be Lewis. What about you?
So I took this a little bit too seriously earlier in the week and set up a spreadsheet to try and figure out.
Yeah, do we get to see the spreadsheet, or is it?
I mean, it's here. Yeah, I have it in front of me. It's just numbers, but they do mean something. I mean, it's not actually that complicated. What I did is I took the season from the summer break onwards to see who would, if you turn that into an 11 race mini season, who would come out on top, in the thinking that would give me the biggest indication of form, basically form both from team and driver going forward. And no, I've already told you who won this mini. I was going to put it to you. Like,
yeah. Wait. You mean we talked before this pod?
But you might think, Lando Norris, right? I mean, he was.
I would have thought that. Honestly, I really would have done.
And I was expecting that to be the case. It's actually Charles Leclerc by 4 points. So 179 points since the summer break. Lando Norris 175 points. Max Verstappen 160 points. And that led me to think, right, Charles Leclerc. I mean, it also backs up your Ferrari theory. And, and if we're looking at a Ferrari potential championship challenge, it's hard to look past Lewis Hamilton right at that team. So I did this maths and I thought,
it sounds like you're about to look past Lewis Hamilton.
Well, I thought, okay, maybe I'll go with Leclerc. Maybe I'll go with Leclerc. Just, here we go.
I think you should do it.
No one ever picks Leclerc at this stage. Following it, I can't do it.
Really?
I can't do it.
I think because I've said Lewis now.
No. Well, who do you think I'm going to say then?
I think you're going to say Lewis.
No,
you're not.
No, I'm going to say Max Verstappen.
Okay.
Because actually, he got 160 points. So he was 19 points behind Leclerc in that period. I just think no matter who is Max's teammate next year, probably Liam Lawson, they're not really going to be taking points off him. And also they're going to be very much on a short leash. You have to help Max win this title. Leclerc v Hamilton,
box office.
If your prediction is correct, could go crazy, could go nuclear. The two of them against each other. I think it will actually be fascinating because Leclerc seems like a teammate who gets very angry at specific times with his teammate, but very rarely causes a major thing. And usually they're laughing by the next race. So I think the two of them will stay together. But still, that's a really hard one to pick because you've got Leclerc incredibly fast over a single lap. Lewis notoriously struggled over a single lap.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, that used to be his strength, didn't it? And you're right. Just to go on that with the Ferrari guys, I struggled making that pick when you threw it at me so heartlessly out of nowhere.
Got another one in a minute
because I think that, to be honest with you, this is where I'm more than happy at the end of the year to say I was completely wrong about it. I think one of the things everyone's talking about Lewis at Ferrari, and I've just said then that he can win the championship. I think one of the most compelling parts of the story is we finally get confirmation of how good Charles Leclerc is. I think we know he's great. We know he's very, very well. We know he's very, very good, right? Is he that level of great? And the line between being very, very good and being great is one that not a lot of drivers get across. And I don't think it's insulting to say he's not great, but we'll find out. If he comes out and if he blows Lewis Hamilton away from the beginning, suddenly you're like, wow, I mean, that is proof enough that you needed. Maybe people could say, well, Lewis has lost a step, whatever. You're still beating Lewis Hamilton. I always felt at Mercedes, Nico Rosberg never got that credit when he was beating Michael Schumacher. Everyone said, oh, Michael's lost a step. He had come back late, but it's like you're still beating the brain. You're still beating the driver, the aura that is in that other car. So if Charles can prove me wrong, hell of a statement. But I just think that where that team is, the experience Lewis has, I think as well, just the knowledge of Max and stuff. But to your point, when you said that about Max, my first thought was 2007, the McLaren drivers taking points off each other all year, letting Kimi Räikkönen in their last championship. Not only are Ferrari potentially going to do that, but McLaren as well with Piastri and Lando.
This is it. I mean, the Piastri Lando thing, I mean, it's not going to be easy to manage next year. I know they did a fairly good job in the end, but it was bungled, wasn't it, with papaya rules and knowing exactly what that meant.
Papaya rules, yeah. Still don't know.
When it was on and when it was off. So I just think that out of all of that, it could still be Max, and the Red Bull, because of that win in Qatar. Had they not won in Qatar, I'm not sure I'd be so certain about it. But because of that win in Qatar, and also the fact he was third on the grid in Abu Dhabi, he obviously had that collision with Piastri. By the way, Max's fault, I think. But indication that Red Bull actually maybe aren't quite as far off at the end of this year as we thought they might be midway through the season when things were really slumping.
Yeah, and I've made the cardinal sin in Formula One of betting against Max Verstappen, which you just can't do.
I've done it enough times.
He's just different level. So, that will no doubt will come back to haunt me down the line. But you said you said you had another one. So
there's one other question that we need to basically to close off the 2024 season. It's an easier one. I'm not going to catch you by surprise. Your biggest takeaway from this 2024 season? What was it?
Ordered a very big Domino's when I was in Las Vegas. No, joking. Is that what you meant? No.
Oh, yeah.
This is a I suppose a slightly negative one, but it's hard to escape this feeling. My biggest takeaway is that the rule change we've got in 2026 is going to be a bit of a disaster. Not in terms of what the cars are going to produce is going to be, because I'm not technically minded at all. But it's such a shame we're at this position where everything in Formula One has just converged in this kind of incredible way. We've got Red Bull winning rate. Every winner this year had two wins at least. And we know what regulation changes are. They're just a big reset button. And I just fear we're going to have an amazing season next year like we had this year. And then maybe go back to square one. And if your team is the one dominating, then you're like, that's great. But it just takes away that excitement factor. So the takeaway is we're in such a great spot right now. It's a shame that potentially we have that so close away. I don't know whether that is a good takeaway to have or not, but that's kind of the feeling I had towards the end of the season.
Well, it's kind of similar to my takeaway, but you're the pessimistic one.
Yeah.
I'm going to be
nice.
the optimistic one.
I like this.
And so my biggest takeaway from the season, and I was talking about this on ESPN Daily's podcast as well, is that this sport can surprise you in a really great way.
Yeah,
this season started with Red Bull dominating. We were talking about it. We were like, how are we going to write 24 times Max Verstappen's won a Grand Prix and then analyze it and then make the next race sound like it's going to be exciting? And, you know, I was getting to a point, I had an interview with Stefano Domenicali in China this year. You know, that was basically the last point of Max Verstappen's uber dominance. And, you know, and a lot of the interview was like, what are you going to do, Stefano? What are you going to do? Sport, you know, how are you going to keep people interested? How are you going to keep them tuned in? And that's because I had that pessimistic mindset of, well, Red Bull are ahead now.
Yeah,
it's going to be the same through 24. It's going to be the same through 25. Maybe 26 will reset it, or maybe we'll just get another one. But this sport's ability to surprise me, and actually, I don't think this is just, you know, the wonders of F1 have come together and McLaren have emerged as a competitor. I think it's actually down to a lot of the hard work that's gone on behind the scenes with things like the budget cap,
very good point.
Capping teams, and then also the ATR restrictions, a bit boring I know, but the aerodynamic testing restrictions where you only get a certain amount of CFD and wind tunnel time, and it's a sliding scale, so the higher you finish up the order, the less you get for the following year. The lower you are, the more you get, kind of like almost like a draft style kind of idea that, you know, you get your first pick where you get your most wind tunnel time. So I think all of that has come together, and also the stable platform these teams have, the fact that none of them are really too worried about the financial situation anymore because they're these strong franchises. I mean, we talked about McLaren. Brown talked about McLaren as recently as 2020 and in the pandemic, but now they all do seem that bit more stable. So a lot of hard work has gone in behind the scenes to create the situation. And I think we are starting to get the fruits from it. So even if
my pessimistic
nightmare scenario of 2026, we turn up and be it a Mercedes or a Red Bull or a Ferrari, 2 seconds down the road, I think the sport this year, my main takeaway is that it does have the ability still to correct itself and provide very exciting racing, because the end of this year is as exciting as I can remember for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, and more exciting race to race than 2021, which is held up as 2021 was great because of the drama and because it was two guys going at each. But if you actually look at that season, there was only a few flashpoints, and all the flashpoints were amazing. But yeah, you're right. And just actually on that, if I can add a second takeaway that maybe, you know, suits what you were saying, we are in such a blessed position in Formula One that every driver that seems to be coming through at the moment is so ready to race in Formula One. It feels like there's just this groundswell of great talent. We're going to have all these rookies next year. Behrman's not officially a rookie, but I always hate that when people say he's not a rookie. It's like he's having his rookie season. Yeah. Behrman's rookie season, Bortoletto, we're probably going to get Hadjar. We're going to have Kimi Antonelli, who I think is going to just be incredible to follow because his career's, you know, it looks like it might start off being up and down. But these guys are coming in and teams are trusting these young drivers, Doohan as well at Alpine. So that's really good. The sport, just to I want to end on a positive one. The sport's never seemed in such good health. It's just a shame that potentially we're hitting the reset button. But you've convinced me. Maybe everything will be all right. Maybe it does feel like now the gap, the teams know they can claw back big gaps. That is something that is true. And that is clear when you talk to engineers, you talk to fans, whatever. It feels more tangible now, whereas before it didn't.
Well, okay, let's end on that positive note. That's all for this week. We will be back again, so keep tuned into ESPN in the meantime, and we'll see you next time here on Unlapped.